important project.
Well, this is almost like school there. It looks like somebody put their hand on everybody's head and everything.
Closer to your mouth.
Anyway, it's great to see such a
You can't hear
full
it.
house of smiling faces here today. It's not working.
Not on loud, no, it's not on.
Good, now. Now you got it. Gary? Okay. Wow, this is the largest number of people we've had since we reinstituted this thing. The birth rate would have gone up or something here in town. Anyway, we're glad you're here. We're looking forward to a great program. And fortunately, everybody's got a chair. So let's get started with our tradition of having a pledge of allegiance read by Dave Logan.
Please face the flag. Read after me, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Find you a comfortable seat, please. Kingsport's organization, I'm a great city manager, and so I turned the microphone over to him to tell us what we need to know about what it was before we got here and what's happened since we got here. Here you go, Jim.
Appreciate it. Thank you. All right, thank you. I'm going to try to adjust this a little bit. Testing. Is that better?
Yep.
Better? Okay. Sorry. I'm going to step over here because I'm right-handed, and when I point, I have to point across my chest if I don't. And so if you can't see this or haven't seen this, I started a blog in January called kingsportspirit.com. The intention is to share little tidbits of information that perhaps you haven't seen before. It's just to put a little different spin on the people and places that make up Kingsport. So if you'd like to subscribe to that, you can. It will be printed in the newspaper once a month, one article, but there's other articles in between. If you're interested in following along, you're more than welcome to do that. So what I'm going to talk about today is what were the development patterns prior to the model city. You know, we always tend to focus on the model city of Kingsport, but this wasn't just a blank slate. When the town planners arrived, there were people here and there were things going on here. What were the original limits of the model city and what neighborhoods sprung up just outside the city limits, and then some of which were later annexed. I know Sarah Lou Ring and I know a lot about that. And what are some of the homes that pre-existed the model city? Who were the people behind the plan and what national trends influenced them? And then what does the evolution of neighborhoods look like from 1917 till about 1959? I had to cut it off there, and we may not make it all the way through to 1959 just because of the volume of material, but I'm happy to come back if I'm invited and we can continue that conversation. So much of the present city limits, much of Kingsport was outside the city limits in 1947. So what's missing? So this is the original corporate limits. So this is right where the outpatient center for Wellmont is. For people in my generation, it was the King's Giant Plaza. So from there, going straight down, did not include Fair Ridge Drive or the back part of Belmead. So our mayor couldn't have been our mayor because he lived outside the city limits back then. And went on down to Highland Park, about where Indian Highland Park is. The Dobbins-Bennett campus, most of it was in the city limits. And then it followed what is today Eastman Road down to the river, back over and then up Westview Park. So about where the railroad underpass is going to Netherland Inn Road was the western city limits. And then going up again to just north of what is now Stone Drive in the Westview and Sevier Terrace neighborhood. That's all that was Kingsport at that time. So when you talk about the planners that are laying out, they plan to put out 50,000 people in that footprint. Now we have 55,000 people in a much larger footprint, certainly not that compact. So when they would start to develop the city, they would set aside vacant territory for future expansion. Well, imagine if the best I can think of is in Florida, where they build new towns. And you go down there and just outside the control of the developer, there's stuff that happens just outside their control. So that was happening here as well. So I'll show you in just a minute, but if you pay attention, you can notice where those edges are. That's a planning term. So Netherland Inn Road was the Lee Highway, Lynn Garden Drive was the Gate City Highway, Clouds Ford Road existed, And Warpath and Orbank existed at that time as paths, and then Horse Creek and Eastman Road were main arteries as well. So you can notice right there, there's no Stone Drive shown between Bloomingdale and Warpath. There's no John B. Dennis. Of course, there's no I-26 or I-81 at the time. And by the way, I do tailor this for high school students as well, so you'd be amazed at how much modern history, we assume everybody knows that they really don't, because the last class I spoke to didn't remember 9/11 because they weren't born. Yeah. So makes me feel old. So the Sanborn fire insurance maps are a great source of information. There's only 3 that I'm aware of for Kingsport, but this one was in 1916, and this is what it looked like. And that was the only reference material they had to be able to fight fires and protect the city. So they mention on page 5 a pulp village and extract village, neither of which I'd heard of, radial streets, 5 Points area, and then the Oak Street neighborhood. So I tend to think of Oak Street more as an incidental street, but it was really a center point for a neighborhood that was planned in the original city. And then you had all of the area along the railroad tracks, which was set aside for the commercial district. Now, look right here. Center Street went to, Commerce Street. It didn't extend any further. So this area was residential at that time. So when you look at the old carriage house on Center Street, for example, or as I knew it, the Eleanor Easton office, those houses, those were houses back then. By 1919, just 3 years later, it had grown substantially actually. The Watauga Street neighborhood started springing up. Gibson Town is referenced. And this area along 5 Points, still Center Street had not been extended. So you still had a single family residential in this area. And then you had the industry along the railroad, and you had residential just across the tracks. I know we think we're being super creative right now talking about development of Brickyard Park, but there were houses south of the railroad track long before they went away, but now they're coming back. And by 1925, it had expanded into Sevier Terrace, Jackson Heights, the 50s and Park Hill, again, Gibson Town, Dobbins Addition, Fair Acres, Borden Village, Edgewood and Beechwood Village, which are out past Eastman as we know it today. And then you had Eastman and then Corning Glass, which became AFG or ASG at one point in time. And then you still had Holston Heights, Cement Hill, and Brickyard Road in 1925. So what were the development patterns prior to the model city? So the red roads are the ones we would recognize today. The blue are what existed back when the town was being developed. So this is the Lee Highway going toward what's now Netherland Road. At times it's been called West Sullivan Street. When I worked in 911 renaming, it was labeled as Knoxville Highway. Some of the stuff was still labeled Knoxville Highway, but Netherland Road clearly existed. This was the Reedy Creek Road going toward Bloomingdale. Sullivan Street came in and split, and it went down the Horse Creek Road to Johnson City, which we know as East Sullivan Street today. And then East Center Street was Bristol Highway going on out the ridge toward Bristol. But the rest of that wasn't there when the original town planners arrived. So some of my aha moments when I'm looking at this is that, I drive through the intersection of John B. and East Stone Drive every day because I live in Preston Forest. But that intersection back when the town was developed would have been right there, what was known as the Upper Circle, because that was 11W. Center Street and Memorial Boulevard was 11W, and then Warpath Drive, the offshoot, would have followed generally the same pattern that John B. follows today. So that, if you could just drag that interchange up, then you really understand how important that interchange was back in that time period, whereas today it doesn't have as much traffic. Also, the split of what we know as East Center Street and East Sullivan Street on the eastern edge of downtown, that was the Bristol-Johnson City Highway split. So when you saw development along East Sullivan Street, that was a main artery at the time. And when the traffic got rerouted, it became less important and there was less traffic, and so therefore there's not a lot of demand for some of the commercial development that happened out that way. It got rerouted and taken away from them. So that moved to what we know today as the Memorial, or the Fort Henry Drive and Center Street split at Dobbins Bennett. The intersection of Sullivan Street and Gay City Highway, Scott County Road, whatever you want to call it, and Bloomingdale Pike was the main intersection, was the most strategic intersection in Kingsport at that time. It's hard for me to process that now because it's so not that at this point in time. That intersection will be equivalent today to the intersection of Stone Drive and I-26. So if you think about, why is Jackson School where it is? Because that was a really key location at that time, particularly. And then Eastman Road, which eventually evolved. Originally it was East Sullivan Street out, and then it just turned, and this part didn't exist. But Eastman Road eventually got shifted west. The traffic did to what became Wilcox Drive, and of course the bridge fell in 1967, and then the sluice bridge has been closed. Sometime during my career it closed. I don't remember when, but it hasn't been open in a long time. So when you talk to folks today and they say, well, yeah, this is still South Eastman Road, that's South Eastman Road, that's South Eastman Road, but you can't get to it because it's not connected because there's no bridges. So that's why Wilcox Drive became such an important artery into town. So what neighborhoods sprung up just outside the city limits, some of which were later annexed? So when you look at the original town plan, which is just this area, just outside the city limits, Highland sprung up. So when you hit Eastman Road and you start seeing a row of buildings that sort of look like a little downtown, that's because it happened outside the city limits, right? There was no zoning jurisdiction or anything like that. So it was a little village node that existed because Kingsport was so prosperous, so people were moving near Kingsport to live. Hillcrest, same thing I just mentioned earlier about the upper circle. That those buildings are coming down now as part of the I-126 project, but that little node was very important. Litz Manor out there at McDonald's on Fort Henry Drive was another village node that happened. Of course, Colonial Heights was a later version that happened across the river bridge. Now, Long Island, I couldn't find pictures, but they had homes listed for sale just across the old sluice bridge in Long Island, which would have been just outside the city limits, but would have been very convenient to working at Eastman or any other plants in Kingsport. Sullivan Gardens has a little downtown area too, and then Fort Robinson, when you drive down Fort Robinson Drive and you notice there's some buildings that are built close together like a little downtown area, they have a little village node as well. And then Lynn Garden and Bloomingdale also popped up. So all of these surrounded the model city. Many of them were later annexed, but if you pay attention, it explains why the sidewalks stopped, the curb and gutter stopped, the building patterns changed, because they happened outside the control of the original town planners. Okay. So what are some of the homes that pre-existed the model city? I'm not going to cover every home. I'm going to focus mostly on the ones that are within the city limits today as we know them. But I would encourage you, if you want to know more, to check out the Historic Homes of Sullivan County. It talks about a lot of the homes that are up in Arcadia, past Bloomingdale, and then also out Sullivan Gardens, past downtown Sullivan Gardens, if you will. And there's a lot of historic homes out that way as well. I'm not going to go into all of those, but these were when the folks started assembling property for Kingsport, this is what they would have seen. Of course, we know Rotherwood, built in 1818 by Reverend Frederick Ross, who founded Rossville, which later merged with Christianville and neighboring Sullivan County to become Kingsport. Joshua Phipps was his caretaker, who ended up buying the property from him after his silk mill failed. And George Carter bought it in 1906. So George Carter, as Ken mentioned earlier, is the guy that assembled the property that became Kingsport Farms and was able to cobble together the land to build a city. He also did East Tennessee State University, and he lived in Bristol. He's probably the most significant person that is not truly recognized in this area for all the contributions that he made. He was also Jeffrey Johnson's brother-in-law. In 1916, John B. Dennis bought it, and then in 1943, he temporarily sold it to the Army because of national defense concerns to build Holston Defense. And he reacquired the property in 1945 and sold it to Herbert Stone. And then in 1980, it sold at auction, and then in 84, Roger Ball, and since 1991, Lanita Tebow has had the property and has done an amazing job of maintaining it. She spent 7 years renovating it, but it's one of the only antebellum homes in Kingsport. Severe Terrace Drive, how many people are familiar with this house already? Okay, so I'm surprised at how many aren't familiar with it, but this is called Mount Ida. These are recent photographs. This is on Severe Terrace Drive, directly behind the West Side Inn. Again, in my generation, we would have known it as the Tennessee Motor Lodge, but it's currently known as the West Side Inn. And So that's the origin of the name Sevier Terrace. The Sevier family owned it. The log house was built in 1790 for David Ross, who ran a nearby iron furnace. His heirs sold the property to David Sevier and Annis Netherland in 1817, and the Seviers lived in the log home for a time until they built a comfortable brick mansion in 1884. So the brick house was built in 1884, which would have been after the Civil War, so therefore it's not antebellum, but it's still very old. Who was David Ross? David Ross was one of the most famous Virginia citizens that existed. He owned many ironworks throughout the state of Virginia. He was of Scottish descent, and he had 3 plantations in and around Lynchburg, Charlottesville, and Richmond, one of which was named Mount Ida. So I don't know if that's how this got its name, but it sure seems pretty interesting that he had a place up there called Mount Ida and then had a place down here called Mount Ida. So why was iron such a big thing back then? I had to really understand that, because we were still related to Britain, and Britain had run out of sources for iron that wasn't an enemy. So they were encouraging the colonies and the United States to supply iron for cannonballs and that sort of thing. So if you could create an iron works, you had a source that you could truly sell. You make a lot of money, and so that's why he did it. So David Ross came down to do that. Well, David was Frederick Ross's dad, who ended up at Robert. So that was the connection there. So who was Sevier? Now, was he kin to the governor? Was this guy kin to the governor? So if you've seen the play Liberty at Sycamore Shoals, which if you haven't, I would encourage you to do that. It's the official play of the state of Tennessee. It tells about the folks that came to Sycamore Shoals and started the state of Franklin, and you get to know all the players who went on to, James Robertson became the father of Nashville. John Sevier became the governor, but you meet all these people and you learn the personalities in this play, and it's a really cool thing. Well, Keziah Robertson was the sister of James Robertson, founder of Nashville. She married Robert Sevier, who was the brother of John Sevier, the first governor of Tennessee. They were members of the Over Mountain Men that went to Kings Mountain and fought and won that battle and really turned the tide of the American Revolution. So if you'll notice, Robert Sevier died in 1780. Why was that? He was mortally wounded in the Battle of Kings Mountain and he didn't make it home. They buried him somewhere near Spruce Pine, North Carolina, en route back to home, but he didn't make it. That same year, his son was born, so she was pregnant before he left for Kings Mountain. And so Valentine Sevier was born, and then he later died in Greene County. He married Nancy Dinwiddie. Their son, David Dedrick Sevier, married Annis Rutledge Netherland, the Netherland Inn relationship, and they bought the property. Nellie Sevier was their daughter. Nellie Sevier married William Roller, and if you know anything about the history of Kingsport and you pull up old plats, the Roller family owned much of the property. It's really interesting because there's not a ton of them around anymore, but back in those days they owned a ton of the property. The brothers D&W Roller, when you look up the ownership, it usually says D&W Roller, and I'm like, who's D&W Roller? I thought were they husband and wife? No, they were brothers. So D was David, his middle name was Sevier. He actually went by Sevier in many cases. His name was Sevier Roller, but D Rollers, which you'll see on the plats and stuff, he had no children. William Roller Jr. had no biological children. So although they had a big interest in this area, they really didn't leave a lot of heirs to carry that going forward. So the William Roller Sr. built the Ridgefields house, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and David Dedrick Sevier built Sevier Terrace, the Mount Ida place. So this is a house that we drive by every single day on the corner of Clinchfield and Stone Drive. It sits over to the left. It was the Gross Close place. It's Gross Close. I forgot to change the term here. Sorry about that. The log cabin was built in 1800, which you can see is back sort of behind the house. And then this house was built in 1861, so it was actually finished the year the Civil War started. And it sits right there across from the big glass HMG building. So Rita passed away a few years ago. I'm not really sure what the future of the house is. I know it's still owned by the family, but that's a significant historical property right in the middle of town. So I thought this was interesting. I asked Valerie last time we were here about the Ridgefields house because her, either your father or
My uncle.
Uncle owned it. And so there wasn't a lot of recollection about the original Victorian house that was there. So let's look at this. As another one of the outstanding homes to be shown in Kingsport during Tennessee Week of the Tennessee Society for the Preservation of Antiquities is Ridgefields, the home of Mr. and Mrs. C.P. Edwards Jr., located on the Ridgefields farm next to Ridgefields Country Club. Here again, the charm of the Old South is combined with modern convenience. In this home of Victorian design, first built in 1850 by Martin Roller, later it was added to by his son William upon his marriage to Miss Nellie Sevier. So that's another antebellum house that doesn't exist anymore, but it was right there at the country club. So it's, best I can tell, it's where the golf pro shop I think is now. And it was located at the head of the ferry, because back in those days there was no bridge to Ridgefields. You could get to it, coming down what we know as Riverport Road now, but there was no bridge across the river at that time. So that was the main entrance to the farm. And so it made sense that at the main entrance was the main house. By today's standards, it's sort of a dead end at the end of toward the dead end of Pendragon, but at those days it was the main entrance. And that came from the Times News in 1953. This is another one I think is interesting that I didn't realize it existed. I know a lot of folks do, but this is directly across the street from the Great Body Company on Memorial Boulevard. Now, that would have been US 11W at the time, right? Or the main road in the area. So it is the Enoch Shipley house. So think Shipley Ferry, buried in the Dixon Shipley Cemetery on Montclair Road. So Montclair Road is overlooking the Fort Patrick Henry Dam. So all that property south of Memorial was related to this and related families. So he married Lucy Ann Roller. So you're starting to see a theme here, lots of rollers. And a descendant of the Roller family who bought much of the original Pendleton land grant that's now Kingsport, and the Rollers owned Roller and Petty John Mill off Fall Creek Road. They are also closely related to the Birdwell or Bridwell family, which is also in that general area. 1612 Watauga Street. So when you go out to the end of Watauga Street and you hit Center Street and you're turning left, now it's eclipsed by these large shrubs. But right behind it is this house that Paula Fox ran as a bed and breakfast for a while. And it looked different than what I remember any other house on Watauga Street looking like, but it was built in 1900. So it would have been 17 years before incorporation. So again, Watauga Street at that time, Center Street didn't go down the hill. Watauga Street was the main road. And it went on down to about just past Linville Street, and it continued sort of straight. So if you know Ken Manus' house on Watauga Street, behind those houses, there's a right-of-way platted that continues on. And so it continued on and meandered down the ridgetop until it came down near the intersection of what we know today as Sullivan Street and Bloomingdale Pike, Lovedale Drive, that general area. So the pioneers did things for common sense reasons. Planners do things because they look nice. So they stayed on the ridge top because it was dry. And so they went down when they built the plan with the radial streets, they had to put a crook in Watauga Street to make it attach to Church Circle the way they wanted it to. So that's what happened. So this was owned by E.C. Barnes. I don't know who he is, but I know that's Barnes Street right beside it, Watauga and Barnes. And I found his name mentioned in Cantrell, Tennessee, which I never had heard of, but it's out there near Central High School off Highway 75. There was a little place historical called Cantrell, Tennessee. And it's also got names like Gunnings and Shipley and Droke and Hamilton, Har, Vance, Anderson, and Boer. So all of those names are still around in historical Sullivan County and modern Sullivan County. So he was definitely kin to all of those folks as well. Also in Highland Park, just around the corner on Center Street, there's a few houses that you may notice. Now, this house now has a Habitat for Humanity house on each side of it, so it looks kind of out of place. But it was all these were built in 1900. So again, these were all pre-existing the modern city of Kingsport by 17 years. Gibsontown and Nelsontown also are areas that existed before. Each of these two homes were built in 1900. So this is at 1010 Gibson Mill Road, which is right at the Holston Floral overlooking Reedy Creek. And then this is 1405 Rufus Road, but it is, there's the old Gibson Mill Road that used to do the S-turns, So if you went through that second S turn, it sat right there. It was the Nelson family. So you had the Gibson family and the Nelson family, and that's Gibsontown, Nelsontown. So Nelsontown is north of Reed Creek, Gibsontown is south of Reed Creek. And if you ever confuse those, Larry Nelson will let you know, because he still lives in Nelsontown. So Fair Acres, we know it as the Dobbins farmhouse mostly because it was the first mayor's house, but it was originally built by Andrew Martin, who married Elizabeth Bachman. Bachman was a pastor in the area and had a big interest in the Horse Creek area and Sullivan Gardens, and they built that house in 1878. So again, that would have been after the Civil War. Their family cemetery is located on Linville Street, so where it goes around the middle, that's the Bachman family cemetery, and Martin Bachman Cemetery. Again, most of us know that house is the 20th century home of our first mayor, James Dobbins. So who are the people behind the plan and what national trends influenced them? So, John B. Dennis is a fascinating person. And when I looked at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle in 1926, it mentions that among other fine estates in the section are the following: the home of Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt, Sagamore Hill, the John Weeks property with a frontage on Oyster Bay, the Gerard Beekman Place, the estate of Bertram Work of the Goodyear Rubber Company, the famous tulip farm of the Zinderbergen brothers, John B. Dennis's homestead on the shorefront east of Ship Point. Okay, so he was a neighbor to a president in New York, right? So Colonel Theodore Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt will arrive in Oyster Bay next week after a short visit. Among the members of the summer colony who have opened their homes for the season, from Brooklyn and New York, Henry Woods, it goes on to mention all these folks, and John B. Dennis is mentioned in 1915 in Brooklyn. So clearly John B. Dennis was a person of means, and so his interests in Kingsport were primarily business, but I'll share a little bit more in just a second. So who is this Blair and Company? So John B. Dennis worked for Blair and Company. Blair and Company is the company that financed Kingsport. So they weren't just venture capitalists and investors in Kingsport. They were interested in all across the country any way they could make money and be good capitalists. So they actually had interest in the Chicago's L, the elevated train, their version of the subway. So I found this article again from Brooklyn. The transfer of the elevated lines to Blair and Company, according to one who has had an active part in the negotiations, is the first step in a consolidation of all the elevated roads. The deal puts the Northwestern, Lake Street, and Union Loop elevated roads under one control, and it'll be necessary to acquire the Metropolitan and South Side elevated roads. The consolidation has been attempted before, but without success. It has been a favorite scheme of Blair and Company, and it is now believed they are in position to carry it through. Who was on the board of directors of the elevated lines? John B. Dennis. Okay, so John B. Dennis. Who was John B. Dennis? The Bristol Herald Courier talks in 1939 about him coming here a quarter of a century ago and bought Robinwood. He was very interested in the cattle in that area. He used the entire farm for that, raising cattle, showing cattle. He sponsored shows all across the South where he was a prize-winning farmer, if you will. So this was sort of his gentleman's farm, and had thousands and thousands, more than 6,000 acres to work with down in Rotherwood. I found this in the Tennessean from 1910, but it was actually an Associated Press article, so it really appeared across the country. It just happened to be the Tennessean. I picked it up in. But it says Thomas Fortune Ryan names them and who they are to be looked at. How here they are to be looked over, 7 future finance kings in the world. J. Pierpont Morgan. Who's that? J.P. Morgan, right? So J.P. Morgan, Otto Kahn, Mortimer Schiff. I don't know, could it be Ken Adams Schiff? I don't know. John B. Dennis, George Baker, James Tillman. So John B. Dennis was a heavy hitter nationally. So in 1996, Margaret Crawford wrote a book called Building the Working Man's Paradise. And in it, she referenced that Nolan's general plan for Kingsport acknowledged the centrality of industrial production. So you have to kind of keep in mind what was going on around the world at the time. There was a big influx of immigrants across the country. They were living in very congested housing. It was unsafe, unsanitary. There was no light, no air conditioning. And so they were trying to figure out what's the right level to keep employees happy and productive and working, and be fair about it, and what is the role of the employer in doing that. So Kingsport became this grand experiment of all that. So they hired Clinton McKenzie, who designed buildings that ranged from impressive Georgian residences for local notables to the Kingsport Inn. Was only one of the prominent architects of the Kingsport Improvement Corporation. Others included Grosvenor Atterbury, Thomas Hastings of Carrera and Hastings, and Electus Litchfield. Well, who are those people, right? So this is my statement. So Kingsport was a national housing experiment, a test case for model housing to offset the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of big city tenements. The first national zoning ordinance was approved in 1916 in New York City. Sound familiar? When were we incorporated? 1917. So that was the thought process of the day, is how are you going to make sure that you do this in an orderly fashion? It was top of the mind for our early founders who were heavily influenced by New York and the ability to lure businesses and talents to the South. So they were trying to create this utopian situation so they could bring people down and say, hey, this is how you can do it. This is how you can have housing and happy workers and productive workers. At the same time, the national trend and international trend actually was garden cities. So Ebenezer Howard he's British, and in 1898 started talking about how, they're having the same problem. They're trying to figure out how to fit all these people in housing in Britain and give them garden spaces. So they started with these ideas that we have a central park and you have streets that radiate out from around it. Sound familiar? So what was at the time, it was all grid patterns. First street, second street, third street, fourth street, A street, B street, C street, D street. And people just go as fast as possible, run red lights, run traffic stop signs. And so they tried to figure out how to do curvilinear to add a little bit of interest. So the garden cities would contain proportionate areas of residences, industry, and agriculture. The pro tip, look for the term green, garden, field, forest, and fair in the neighborhood, i.e. Garden Drive, Forest Street, Green Fields, Green Acres, Garden Apartments, Fair Acres, and Richfields, for example. That's a note to kind of key you that that's what they were trying to accomplish when they build those kinds of neighborhoods. You can't hardly see these, but this is Green Hills, Ohio, Greenbelt, Maryland, and Radford, New Jersey. And if you can see, those look very similar to the street patterns that were developed in Kingsport at the time. So that was what was going on nationally. The City Beautiful movement, the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, it's pointed to as a real change in the way city planning took place, because there was a lot of discussion that the United States didn't really have an architectural theme. They used everybody else's architectural theme but didn't have their own. And so they started looking at ways that we could create big grand plazas and symmetry and things like that. So the World's Fair in 1893 looked like this. They had a central tower, they were flanked on both sides. All those buildings were temporary. They were all basically torn down. But they called it the Great White City. Sound familiar again? But that White City was a big term back then. They also displayed a model city. Now again, that's their term. A model city of grand scale, of Gilded Age splendor. Whether found on the tree-lined city square or in the old courthouse on Main Street, the beauty we inherit and the beauty we can give is a wonderful gift. Let us not fall apathetic to that. Who was Clinton McKenzie? So this is Clinton McKenzie's house on Long Island. He built Shelby Road, Park Hill, which we also know as the 50s. His estate is listed on Old Long Island's Gold Coast. There's a website if you want to check it out, Old Long Island's Gold Coast, alongside names like Vanderbilt, Woolworth, Roosevelt, and Chrysler. Those are household names, aren't they? He was also an avid yachtsman and is famous for being part of the decision to deny the English men's protest against the American team, which was Vanderbilt. It was the closest Britain ever came to winning the America's Cup. Again, do you see any similarities to Kingsport? Tudor style, that was a big thing. So these folks just didn't come down here and just start from scratch. They brought their ideas with them that they've been implementing across the country. Kingsport Inn, of course, which is long since gone. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because y'all are very familiar with it, but why were courtyards so important? Again, I usually use this for high school students because there was no air conditioning back then. So if you didn't have courtyards, you couldn't have air circulating, so you couldn't have big closed spaces. You needed an outside window, if at all possible, to provide access to light and air. Same thing as tenements. Views inside the Kingsport Inn, I had folks that would come up and talk to me about, oh, you remember this, you remember that? And I thought, no, I don't remember. And I finally found the menu, a commemorative menu one time. The last meal served at Kingsport Inn, it was the spring before I was born. So that's why I don't remember. I was beating myself up for having a bad memory. The block houses, as Clinton McKenzie called it, he designed these as well on Shelby Street. If you notice, he has different styles, like some are row houses, some are duplexes, some are quadplexes, some are single family, and he was trying to provide a variety of options just to see kind of what stuck. And he did a book called Industrial Housing, published in 1920, and used these as an example of how you could do it. So it was like a showcase city, if you will, to show how these things could happen. Park Hill, development number 2 is what they called it. This shows attached homes in Park Hill, and that's what it looked like back in 1920. Of course, it looks very similar to this day, and it's one of the most beautiful neighborhoods in Kingsport. Development number 3, and this is one that's largely overlooked, is Forest Street and Myrtle Street. We call it Little White City. It's down below, but this is right there is where Hunger First was located. It used to be Oak Street, and that's labeled Bristol Highway and Myrtle Street. But those houses all in behind there were all part of Clinton McKenzie's designs back in 1920. And you can see what it looked like in 1920. This is a design that came from the book, and this is what it looks like today. So you can see it's the same house from 1920. Also in development 3, this is on Forest Street, right where Little Street comes in and near Watery. But that's one of the example houses, and I just pulled that off of Google Street View. That's what it looks like today. So you can see he planned that house, and they had the different types of how many rooms, how many bathrooms, and so forth. But they still exist today, and these aren't in historic districts at all, but they probably should be. 3-story flats. He designed this in his book, showed this in his book from 1920. And the best we can figure that this is the outcome, which is Markham's Pharmacy today, up on Broad Street in Ravine. And if you haven't been up there, they've just completely renovated it. And these pictures are from inside the renovated flats. So I love to see these older places and older homes get new love, if you will. But they only built one corner. The plan was to go all the way around the block and create a court in the middle, but they only finished one corner of it. Development number 4 that they planned was called Negro Village. We now know it as Borden Village. So what happened? Well, the Borden plant decided to locate here, and Mr. Borden wanted housing for his company. So this was laid out on a drawing board, but not built yet, so they converted it to employee housing for Borden, and then they just put off building the black community until later, which I'll cover in a minute. But this is Birch Street. This is typical homes that Clinton McKenzie designed, again, 1920 from New York. This is what it looks like today on Birch Street. So you can see the same basic plan. This is Federal Street, this is Pine Street, this is Borden Park, which at that time was called the Oaks, Willow Street, Chestnut Street, and right through here is where Wilcox Drive goes today. Of course, it didn't exist back in the time. You can see where you go into the one-lane underpass, and it says to Johnson City. That's Lincoln Street as we know it today. Broad Street development was also in Clinton McKenzie's book. So many of the houses, if you notice, in the 900 block of Watauga, the 900 block of Broad Street, those are all Clinton McKenzie style houses. And there is a demarcation once you get past, say, Tennessee Street on Watauga Street. It changes sort of dramatically. But those houses were developed by Clinton McKenzie. Some of them have the 2-story patios on the front. They're very interesting designs. But so if you notice this kind of barn-looking house, that shows it here. That's what it looks like today, because Holston Valley was planning to expand and then changed plans in midstream, and so they bought a bunch of houses and tore them all down and put parking lots or whatever, and so now those houses are gone completely. So I've always had this desire to, when things settle down with ballot and all that, is to reach back out to them and say, hey, your plan's changed. What's the possibility we could get some of these unused parking lots and put them back and rebuild some of these top houses to have houses in the middle of downtown that would fit. This is another one, corner of Broad and Sevier, that is no longer there, just to give you an idea. This house is still there. This is 917 Watauga Street. That's what it looked like in the picture from 1920 that Clinton McKenzie designed. That's what it looks like today. So we do have that area that's still standing. This is the corner of Sullivan Street and Wilcox Drive. There was, he built the Federal Club, which later became the Union Club, and then finally the Borden Club before it closed. But it's showing what a multifamily complex would look like at the time, because they were trying to house people while the town's being developed. Today, it's the Sullivan County Regional Health Department and EMS. Never in my lifetime do I remember this building standing. Oh my goodness, look at that building. How beautiful would that be? So Grossman or Atterbury, well, he did White City. I'm not gonna spend a ton of time on White City, but he also was responsible for Forest Hills Gardens in Queens, New York on Long Island. And so if you pull up a map of Forest Hills Gardens, that's what it looks like. If I clipped it off about right here, you could say it looked like the radial streets around Church Circle, right? Yeah. This is what Forest Hills Gardens looks like today. You see some of that looks like driving down Linville Street, if you ask me. That's in Queens, New York. That's in Queens, New York. You see the pitch of the houses are very similar, but they use the white clapboard in this situation. He also did a substantial amount of work for John D. Rockefeller. And so he's another famous architect that did a lot of work in Kingsport. You remember back in those days, there wasn't a industrialization of home building. So each house that got built was somewhat customized. And so the whole idea was, how can we build houses quicker and replicate good design rather than just having to take so long to build each individual house. So he was very interested in that, and White City was an example of what he was trying to illustrate to others that could be done if you would build similar houses with pre-cut materials, that sort of thing. Electus Litchfield, he was a devotee of municipal beautification. His most famous development was York Ship Village, which is now Fairview in Camden, New Jersey, near the shipyard in 1916. Again, that's the layout of what he designed. Does that look familiar? Looks like the radial streets again, right? And then he also did multifamily apartments. And again, remember, back in those days, they would build them like L shapes, H shapes, all different kinds of shapes, because they were trying to provide maximum exposure to the outside so you could raise a window and get circulation. So that also looks eerily similar to garden apartments, if you ask me. So Thomas Hastings was another, and over here it says the third building of the community center. Kingsport Utilities Building is the second of 3 structures planned for a community center in Kingsport. The first structure erected was the new post office, which is now the library. The utilities building is now the bank, and then the middle building never got built. The idea of the community center was conceived by John B. Dennis 15 years ago, and the general plan for the center was drawn by Thomas Hastings. Alan Dryden did the utilities building. So when the connecting building is the parking lot where the gazebo is on Shelby Street. So that building was supposed to have like that cupola, looked sort of like the old Dobbins Bennett or Severe Middle School, and then the library and the bank were 2 flanking wings off of that. They decided not to do that because there was no place to park. So they built the new City Hall in the 60s where it was on Center Street until just recently. But who was Thomas Hastings? He was also famous for doing the New York Public Library on 5th Avenue. So he designed that on 5th Avenue. He also designed the Cannon Office building for the House of Representatives and the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Arlington. So again, it's pretty impressive to have him doing work here in Kingsport. But home building follows road building, and so the Lee Highway, which ran all the way through town, which was US 11W, in 1925 says, with the exception of several stretches between Indian Springs and Blountville, the new Lee Highway has been opened to traffic for its full length from Kingsport to Bristol. I mean, that's almost 10 years after Kingsport was incorporated. We almost have a paved road to Bristol, you know? So it entices the driver to speed. It's hard, in fact, the driver to keep from speeding when he gets on it. However, it should not be used as a speedway, et cetera, et cetera. So what does the evolution of home building look like each decade of Kingsport's existence? So in 1926, this ad appeared in the newspaper. It says, I have real estate in all parts of the city. Anything you may want in real estate, I have it. I'm just completing 3 new homes on Highland Street and Highland Park. You will make no mistake by buying real estate in Kingsport. Kingsport's growth is now more rapid and more consistent than it's ever been. Come in and talk the matter over with me. I believe I can show you. In the residence sections, new homes are being built on almost every street. In many sections, entire groups of houses are under construction. Never before has there been such building activity. There's no question now, it seems, that the future of Kingsport is assured. So again, they're just trying to build, get a city started, make sure it's going to keep going. But what happened 3 years after 1926? Stock market crash. And then the next 10 years up to 1939, the Great Depression. And then the Depression technically ended in 1939 when World War II started. And the United States got into World War II in 1941. So in talking to Ken about city management things, much of the infrastructure that was put in town was substandard materials because all the materials were needed for the war effort. Yeah. So we had to go back in the 80s and 90s and 2000s and spend millions of dollars to replace a lot of that because it wasn't designed to last forever because it was needed for the war front. So when you think about Kingsport being incorporated in 1917 and then the stock market crash and the Great Depression and World War II, I mean, it's a miracle we have a town at all, to be honest with you. This is from 1925. I thought this reminded me of Clinton McKenzie's house in Long Island, although it's a much smaller version. It's a Spanish style. It was very popular at the time. Grenada Court. So H.C. Brooks, Citizen Supply. You recognize that name. There's been some misunderstanding as to the proper way to pronounce Grenada Court. Kingsport's new residential section. This should be pronounced as Grenada, I guess. And it's located at Catawba Street and Watery Street. There's a little connector called Grenada. And so that explains why those houses look different at that particular location. Brickyard Row, again, we're talking right now about putting houses back on Cement Hill at Brickyard Park, but this is from 1926. A striking example of the attention which is being given to the comfort and welfare of the laboring man's family is the group of 24 attractive new homes which has just been completed by the Kingsport Brick Corporation. And that, when you look closely, that says Brickyard Row, or Hill Street. So that got absorbed into the brick plant, but now they're talking about the whole Brickyard Park having a similar thing. In 1914, the Bristol Herald Courier, again 3 years before incorporation, they talk about, I love the society pages, I miss those. It says, November 3rd, on the last Saturday evening, the Kingsport Club, Holston Heights, Kingsport, entertained a number of guests at their annual Halloween party. The club rooms were beautifully decorated, etc. Music was furnished by the Johnson City Orchestra, and dancing was engaged until a late hour. Well, that was located across the railroad tracks, Hill Street. This was Penn-Dixie Cement, and it went up and kind of serpentined up the hill, and then over here was the Clinchfield Club on the opposite side looking out over the river. And of course, none of that exists to this day, but there used to be housing up there. So I found a reference from a very early newspaper that referenced the Holston River at that time was called the Tennessee River. And so they decided to change it at some point, but it was labeled the Tennessee River in those newspaper articles. Now, I'm not suggesting that all these houses are Sears home kits, but again, think about trying to build housing and have a repetitive pattern that you could have. You could buy house plans, you could buy the materials that match the house plan so you knew exactly what kind of lumber you needed, what kind of windows, doors. It's all pre-measured for you. Sears made a fortune, and you can go all across the country and see these Sears home kits houses. And again, I'm not suggesting that all the houses in this area were done that way, but prior to 1940, I think if you look at any of those could be in that area I'm describing, which would be Radial Street, Center Street, West Sullivan Street, Catawba, and Watery. But those are all Sears kit homes. Those $2,400, how nice would that be? Similar, they had working cottages, which you see a lot of this style over in Borden Village and Lynn Garden. Perhaps one of the oldest neighborhoods that we overlook is Westview. This is from 1917, 20 days after incorporation. Exclusive agents, Westview Park lots and Choice Business lots, McGee, Nonnell, and Near. So they were selling lots in Westview. So this was the city limit, which is Riverside Avenue, Sullivan Street, and then right over here is I-26 now. And then right down what is now Stone Drive was the dividing line. But you see all that was in existence in 1938. But right to the west of it, the Sevier Estate was largely undeveloped at that time, which later became Sevier Terrace. But all of those two streets along Riverside and Fairview are some of the oldest neighborhoods in Kingsport. The fire insurance maps downtown, this shows the single family houses on the side streets where Sullivan and Center Street exist today. But they went down Wexler Street, Island Street, all of those streets leading up to Cherokee had individual houses on them. I did think it was interesting on this particular map I found, you can't see that, but it says Watery Street. We would know that today as Mission Street. So it was supposed to go through Lee Apartments and then connect to Watery Street, which would have been where the high school was located. Pulp Village and Extract Village, this is a recent example. The Phillips family remodeled these houses. They were built in the early 1920s. I found these references, says to sell or exchange 1 6-room house in Pulp Village with water and lights for small farm, number 232 Branch Street. And then down here, officers raided Lincoln's home on Roller Street in Extract Village late Saturday night. Those making the raid were whatever officers. So Roller Street extended south of Center Street. And one of the reasons I know that's because that's where my mom grew up, was south of Center Street on Roller Street. It's now all part of the meat plant now, or the Domtar plant. But aren't those cute, quaint houses? And those were all original to that area. Beechwood Village, Edgewood. This is Eastman Road and Lincoln Street. It's a great big parking lot right in front of Eastman. But it was a Edgewood Village. You can see the houses are labeled here. Then over here, Beechwood Village existed. It's about where John B. Dennis crosses Lincoln Street now. In that general area was Beechwood Village. So you'll see references to those names. Those neighborhoods don't exist at all anymore. Borden Village, 1925, in today's issue of the Times, there appears another announcement that should bring good cheer to the heart of every citizen. The announcement that Bertram Borden listed Borden Mills is about to begin construction of 100 dwelling homes. Sevier Terrace, this sale will be of special significance due to the fact that the lots are located in one of Kingsport's most desirable residential sections, which faces on the Lee Highway, which of course is now West Sullivan Street. So you can picture those houses from 1927. Colored section. So this is fascinating to me because I've always wanted to know what happened. You know, they didn't build the planned Negro Village, Borden Village that we know today. So the area along Sevier Avenue, Dale Street, Myrtle Street, south of Center Street became the focused area. That was where most of the housing was for the black community. And I thought it was interesting, just a few snippets here. This house is at 1028 Walnut Street, which is 1028 East Sevier Avenue. Now they changed the name of the street, but that's a Google Street View of the same house. So it was built in 1930, but that's a view of it in 2023. Over here it says Post 5. Mrs. J. Fred Johnson will be chairman of Post 5, located in the colored section of Kingsport. Mrs. W.C. Pechtel, Mrs. Charles Gibson, and Mrs. R.L. Peters will be the white aides. Colored aides will be Mrs. Ella Howell, Mrs. V.O. Dobbins, Mrs. James Stafford, Mrs. Louise Leach, et cetera, et cetera. But they were trying to figure out race relations. It's just died. Just died. They were trying to figure out race relations even back then. So while they didn't quite get it right, it was they were certainly trying to figure it out. So they had separate but equal facilities for schools, and they were trying to figure out all that. I also found a clip where the Kingsport Improvement Corporation was giving away free garden plots to both white and colored, so they didn't discriminate even back in 1917 as to who they shared property with. Glenwood Heights, which is located out off East Center Street, 1930. This house is in that section today. It just recently sold for $103,000. And of course, this is the old Dixon School property, Joe Begley's houses that he built out there. And those houses sold for around almost $400,000 today. So again, that would have been Highway 11W, you know, at the time, just outside the city limits. Litz Manor and Warpath, this was fascinating to me because I knew there used to be a Litz Manor school, and I knew that they built 2 cul-de-sacs on it. Joe Begley actually renovated a house on it, like it was Lawndale and Wooddale, I think are the names of the streets. And but again, it was outside the city limits. So as the city grew and more people came into the city for schools, there was less students to populate that school. But the Litz Manor School was actually replaced a Warpath school that pre-existed it. So Warpath is the oldest name out there, not Litz Manor. I thought Warpath was just a name they came up with, but actually Warpath School existed first. So it burned to the ground in 1935, and then they announced the Litz Manor edition in 1929. So that's out there just behind McDonald's on 14th Drive. I love this. Drive out to Fair Acres. So Yeah, Kingsport's newest, most beautiful homes. It blows my mind. 1931. Fair Acres is considered out there. Russ Brogdon and I were just talking about how spoiled we are about how close things are. But back then they thought Fair Acres was even out there, so they thought it was a suburb. Bellevue, also off Center Street. These are some of the examples of houses that were built in that time period. This is indications pointed today to Kingsport's huge construction program carrying well into the year 1938. As announcements were made, the property located east of Highland Park on Highway 11W have been divided into home sites. The Bellevue addition will have 65 acres. Again, that's 1937. These are some of the houses that were built and what they sold for recently. So 212,000 and 110,000, just to give you an idea. Oak Grove, out just across from the Upper Circle at Warpath Drive. Again, these are, they talk about the new Henry Miller. There's a Miller Street out there, Bridwell Street and so forth. And then look at these houses are in that neighborhood that were built in 1938, and they just recently sold for $229 and $144. So I love to see this reinvestment in our existing homes. It makes for a super interesting story about Kingsport. Ridgeway, Ashley Street, and also Ridgeway Drive. Again, two houses, 1938 and 1940, have been loved, and they just recently sold for $210 and $153. Riverview really didn't happen until the late 1939, 1940.
Talk loud.
Okay. Riverview didn't really happen until 1939, 1940 because the plan was to try to figure out how to build public housing. And so they were going to build white public housing and black public housing. So they named the white public housing Robert E. Lee, and then they needed to pick a name for the black public housing. And so they picked the name Riverview. It was a contest. It didn't have anything to do with the neighborhood. It was just a nice name that they could all agree on. It also happened to be the name that was the old Riverview Hospital that didn't exist anymore down on Netherland Inn Road. So that's how Riverview came to be. They sold 53 lots rapidly in the Riverview Homes development surrounding it. And they also built defense homes out there. So if you see the speed brick homes, you'll see some in Ridgefield or in Riverview. You'll see some in like on Sevier Avenue, but they all came from that Defense Homes initiative. And they had Riverview Edition was included. Fort Robinson, again, these are two recent examples of houses that just sold in Fort Robinson, 195 and 235, which I thought was great. Let Lauren Walker show you. Oakwood Forest, 1950 and 1948, these two houses just recently sold for $265 and $305. Out just not quite Green Acres, but just right there at the new post office off Eastman Road. Baysview Speed Bricks. So the Lamont Street, anything east of Lamont Street was the original golf course, Kingsport Golf Club. And they decided to develop it into housing. Well, when they started it, it was before World War II started, and then World War II started, so they had to change horses midstream. So they started out on the 1600 block of Sevier Avenue and Carolina and Pinola, and they look very different. Those houses have different designs. The 1500 block and lower are the defense homes. So they have the speed bricks because they had to build housing as quickly as they could to house the influx of people that were coming in here to work at Holston Defense and all the different plants. So it's a really sporadic kind of development, but Baysview extends from Eastman Road all the way to Lincoln School. So really Morningside Circle, Waverly Road, Magnolia Avenue, all of those are tied together. But if you were just today, if you drove through, you wouldn't necessarily make that mental connection because they don't seem like they're as connected as the plan was established. Westwood Hills out Ashley Street, that's a 1946 house, 46 development, and I always thought it was on the Johnson City Highway. Kind of interesting to see that the terms that they used at the time. Two houses just recently sold out there for $226 and $154. Again, love seeing these infill houses. Forest Hills, which is out in Colonial Heights. Two houses just sold out there, 1953, $222,000. For sale, Forest Hills Edition, only one block off Johnson City Highway in Colonial Heights, 48 beautiful homesteads. You know, this is about the time they're starting to talk about a lake out there and a dam. So it really started to evolve into a nice neighborhood to want to live in. I thought this was cool just because I found it in the Library of Congress, Ridgefields. So Olmsted and Associates, Olmsted is one of the most famous landscape architects in the country. He'd go to any park or major national design, and you'll see Olmsted used repeatedly. Well, that firm is who was brought in to do Richfields. And so it says, within a short distance of Kingsport's western city limits, an exceptional residential community has been planned for families. It goes on to say that it is the plan of the developers to make it possible for families of moderate means to enjoy the advantages of this high-top development. Prices are as low as $1,350. $1,350. So if you look at this plan, again, which is in the Library of Congress, it's pretty much the same plan that you would see if you were out there today. And so it was a very visionary plan. There are some connections that didn't happen, like I think this is Silverdale and Sunningdale. You noticed it was supposed to extend all the way back to the golf course, but it kind of abruptly stops. I think there was some new houses built on those two lots here recently. People didn't even know there were lots because there hadn't been a house ever at that location. But some of those connections didn't get built, but for the most part, they did. Today, let's see, the Oaks to Acorns saying has been proved once again. From an idea in the minds of a few forward-looking people has grown a new residential subdivision which Kingsport views with pride. I'm speaking of Ridgefields, of course, where the first new homes are now nearing completion. City water is available here. The subdivision has been approved for FHA home financing, and more new roads are about to be added. The country club and swimming pool will be in operation this summer, and long-range plans include a complete shopping center. Ask Bennett and Edwards about your future Ridgefields home site. And long, linear, ranch-style homes prevalent in the day, and they are still commanding a very nice price at that location. Dorna Court off Warpath Drive. I don't know where the name Dorna came from, but along Warpath Drive, all of that section that's still very beautiful to this day started about 1950. And these are two houses that recently sold, 246 and 244 off of Warpath Drive. Now, in my mind, that ought to be like $50,000 or something, but by today's standards, this is what the houses are selling for. And people are buying these, and they are really investing to make them brand new. And I think that's what the beauty of when I do the Move to Kingsport program, and I talk to people about the housing options here. I think a lot of folks just think it's some all new construction, but no, it's really, we have a diversity of housing, and it really creates an interesting situation for us. Lake Crest and Colonial Heights in 1951, a couple of houses existing today, 234 and 120. Patrick Henry Heights, which is off of Walton Circle, 320, and you see that beautiful knotty pine. Remember those walls? A lot of folks painted them, but my gosh, this is a current example. That house sold for $320,000. Hemlock Park on what is now the lake. It wasn't a lake at the time. That house just sold for $600,000 on the lakefront in Kingsport. Midfield, Kingsport's newest community of homes, North Stone Drive. This 1963 home just sold for $364,000 in Midfield, excuse me. And then Patton Heights, off Afton Street in West Kingsport. Again, split levels were the order of the day in the late 50s and early 60s. 310 and 179, and you see those are still beautiful homes to this day. Green Acres, 1958. I thought this was interesting because it says, featuring light conditioning as recommended by the American Home Lighting Institute, adequate wiring for full house power. So, I don't know, I guess we had kerosene lamps or something before that. And you still see those are still, it's a very desirable and beautiful neighborhood to this day. Houses selling for $315 to $250. Severe Terrace, similar, house sold for $260. That's on, that's right off Severe Terrace Drive. And so this is what I'm doing now in my volunteering role with the Chamber, is the Move to Kingsport program. And I love to meet people that are coming in here and trying to learn what the community is about. But we were just named one of the Wall Street Journal and Realtor.com's top 7 emerging markets in the nation. And I think that speaks very well to the plans that were put in place so many years ago and the benefits that we're still reaping today. Of course, it also puts a chip on our shoulder to make sure that we maintain that going forward. So I hope we leave the place a little better than we found it, but I'm happy to answer any questions about that. Concludes my presentation. So, any questions?
Let's give Jeff another round of applause.